Hello everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at the rise of slavery in the American colonies, and we're going to be doing so by focusing particularly on Virginia, which is in this Chesapeake region that we also discussed last lecture. Now, where we left off in discussing Virginia was talking about the shortage of labor there and how that problem was solved. Now, obviously, you know the spoiler to this plot. It was solved by slavery, and racialized slavery in particular. However, why and how it was solved by slavery is not as obvious as it might seem. The racial prejudice that we are familiar with today was not something that was fully developed at the beginning of English settlement in the colonies. And the ideas that went into and enabled enslaving Africans and the legal code that developed to support it was something that evolved over about 100 years. Moreover, as we will be looking at today, this process resulted not merely from dynamics between white settlers and enslaved Africans, but dynamics and conflicts between white settlers and native peoples, and conflicts between white settlers themselves based on class. So let's go back to Virginia. First, however, let's remind ourselves exactly where Virginia is. Here's this map again of the early English colonies on the East Coast. Everything in red is English. And you can see the Chesapeake labeled right there in the middle of the map. Also, Jamestown is listed on this map, and you can see the Chesapeake Bay. So just to remind ourselves where we are in space. So, as we discussed in our last lecture, labor shortage was a major problem in the early settlement in the Chesapeake, especially as tobacco became the primary cash crop and sufficient labor was needed to work the fields. Again, tobacco is a labor-intensive crop. The first system that was developed to deal with this shortage was called indentured servitude. And what indentured servitude was, essentially, was temporary slavery. While you were a servant of a master, you had to obey his orders completely, and you had very little legal autonomy. However, this was a situation excuse me. This was a situation that was contracted to usually last only about 4 to 5 years. And in the case of children, sometimes as many as 7 years. Sometimes, however, these terms of service could end up being longer, because one way your master could punish their servant, or a master could punish a servant for disobedient behavior, was by lengthening the time of their service. But once you were done with this service, you were granted land, especially in the earlier years of settlement, generally about 50 acres, and the freedom to try to make it on your own. Legally, you are no longer a slave. Now, as we mentioned last time, many settlers were given land as soon as they arrived, but these were the settlers that were wealthy enough to pay for their own passage across the ocean, and were wealthy enough to provide the initial costs of setting up a farm on land. So while that option was open to some, less wealthy individuals also tried to get a hold of some land of their own by serving temporarily as indentured servants. And the idea was actually they would serve until the costs of their trip over the Atlantic that had been provided for by their master was worked away, right? That debt was essentially worked off. So it's important to note that although they were not slaves for life, being an indentured servant while it lasted was extremely unpleasant, and you had little to no power via your master during these years. Moreover, indentured servitude developed in Virginia in a way that legitimized the use of human lives as nothing more than a mere means to a financial profit. For example, when one master raped his indentured servant, he was indeed tried and eventually executed for this crime. But he was not tried and executed for rape, but rather for sodomy. But his servant did not thereby win his freedom, even for this violation of sodomy that did count as a crime. But instead the servant was ordered by the court to find another master who was, in turn, then to compensate the court for the trouble of convicting his original master. As one historian has put it, a servant in Virginia, as long as his term had not expired, was a machine to make tobacco for somebody else. So the moral of that little story, so to speak, is that the court and society as large in Virginia, right, really didn't care that this servant had been violated and brutally raped. They just cared that in the process of raping him, the master had committed sodomy, right, homosexual sex. So the servant didn't get any benefits, even from him being, persecuted for something that had nothing to do with whether or not it was wrong for him to violate and rape his servant. He was rather given away to somebody else. So there develops a society that's just very brutal and very willing to use human beings as nothing more than a tool for profit. So it's laying a foundation. Even though this is indentured servitude and the vast majority of these indentured servants are white Europeans, it's still laying a foundation for a kind of brutal labor regime. As I just mentioned, the vast majority of indentured servants in these years were white people from England, and this constituted at first a much more popular source of cheap labor than enslaved people from Africa, and there were several reasons for this. In 1660, only about 1,000 African slaves lived in Virginia. First, the supply of cheap labor from England was abundant, due in part to civil and political unrest in England, and a population rise in England that worried elites that there was too many people, and too many poor people in particular. And there were also a lot of English people looking for a way to start a better life. Remember again, all of these former peasants, or maybe the children of people who would have been peasants, who are now pushed off the land and are sort of roaming around like vagabonds in England, or living in horrible conditions in the city, trying to find another option. Moreover, if the supply of servants from England was considerable, the supply of enslaved Africans was not. For most of the century, for most of the 1600s, also known as the 17th century, right? Sometimes that phrase dynamic can get confusing. For most of the 1600s, the Portuguese and Dutch controlled the majority of the slave trade, and they tended to take their ships elsewhere, to the Caribbean and South America. Makes a lot of sense. That's where the huge sugar plantations are. That's where New World slavery really started taking off. Therefore, very few slave ships stopped in the ports of Virginia, so they simply were not around that much. Moreover, the prices for enslaved people were higher than they would later become, and so many planters viewed indentured servants as the cheaper investment. So they're cheaper and they're much more available. Finally, most planters probably felt more comfortable hiring people who looked like them to work on their farms, although, as we will shortly discuss at length, full-blown racism that assumed automatically the inferiority of African peoples to be both universal and very specific was not yet developed. But nonetheless, most Europeans likely harbored some basic beliefs that Africans were different from, or at least somewhat inferior to, European people. Nonetheless, racial boundaries during the mid-17th century were radically more fluid than they would soon come to be. African slaves and servants were not, it appears, treated more harshly than white servants, and moreover, both white and black servants and slaves slept in the same quarters, ate together, and even tried to escape together. Moreover, many masters clearly assumed that their African servants and slaves would be allowed one day, like white servants, to set up their own homesteads and become free. Sometimes the means to do this was provided for in masters' wills, and it appears that they and the rest of the community assumed such freed people would integrate into the community like anyone else. So, although this was far from a paradise of equality, and in fact Virginia was built on harsh and strict control of labor, in earlier years it was not at all clear that someone's race would fully and clearly determine their ultimate or permanent position in the social hierarchy. However, if this was the picture in the mid-17th century, things rapidly changed by 100 years later. And between 1680 and 1750, the African population in Virginia went from a mere 7% to 44%. So here's the question of the lecture that sets up the rest of it. Why did this happen? Why? There are several reasons, of course, but we're going to try to get at the heart of the dynamic by looking at an incident, specifically in 1676, that brought together many dynamics of the developing colony. So what's the context of this event that happens in 1676? Well, by the 1670s, a large population of unemployed freedmen, which means former indentured servants who now were free, were starting to cause social unrest in Virginia. So they're free, but they're either very poor or unemployed. By and large, these were former servants, right, who had completed their terms, but they either could not hold on to their land due to the expenses and debt involved with that, or they were unable to extract any profit from the land in any case because they could not compete with the larger established planters who had gobbled up the best and most productive land. This was especially true because the boom market in tobacco that had characterized earlier decades in Virginia had given way to a depression in the economy and a depression in tobacco prices. Something larger plantations were able to weather, not surprisingly, much better than smaller ones. Moreover, the equipment needed to get a farm up and running could often be more expensive than freedmen could afford. So here you have a large population of men who, after spending years as the dejected and abused subjects of richer men, finally got their freedom with the promise of being masters of their own farms, only to find themselves, again, landless in most cases, and certainly poor. Not surprisingly, they were a bitter group, and they took their frustrations out in various ways, such as stealing pigs from farmers for easy food, encouraging rebellions amongst servants that were still serving their terms, and most crucially, starting wars with native peoples on the frontiers and the borders of the colony. They also tended to stir up a lot of trouble during election time. So in 1670, the Colonial Assembly passed a law stipulating that you had to have land to vote. So they are seeing that there is a growing population of angry, bitter, former servants that, if they were continuing to vote, would probably eventually get enough numbers to pass laws and policies that were not to the interests, right, of the gentry elite in the colony. So, in 1678, they tried to respond to the political threat by one of the most effective ways to deal with the political threat, which is prevent the political threat from voting. But this was just one move to try to get the unruly freeman population under control. The problem was that wealthier planters could not just banish or jail these men because they still relied upon the same supply for cheap labor. Yet, respect for authority was weak in Virginia. Colonists took English traditions of defiance of authority with them to the Chesapeake, yet they left the institutions that kept that defiance in check back in England. In a frontier situation where a colony barely keeping itself existent was set up in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by strange and sometimes hostile native people, the trappings and enforcement mechanisms of establishing hierarchy were very weak. This is part of the reason why labor discipline was so harsh. It had to be, because the usual social pressures and institutions that maintain status relations were not nearly so present in Virginia as they were in England. In addition, the elites of Virginia were not to the par of the elites back in England. They were people who would certainly not be in a top rung in England, and of course the freedmen knew this, right? They knew that these people who had gobbled up the best land and were acting so much their betters would be very crushable, right, in the English context, and this increased, right, their tendency, right, to downplay the legitimacy of the authority of the elites in Virginia. And because of this situation, it was essential that elites stay united, that they never be tempted to appeal to the quote-unquote rabble, as they often referred to these free men, in order to settle scores with one another. Because any legitimization of the freemen's grievances could be very, very dangerous for them politically. So this is the context in 1676. And it was precisely a crack in the solidarity that led to the outbreak of civil war in that year. Now this began when skirmishes with various native tribes led to the belief in Virginia that all native peoples were planning on attacking the colonists, and basically that Native Americans could not be trusted as a whole. Now this belief persisted despite the fact that the colony had arranged several friendly agreements with many tribes. Indeed, if it wasn't for Native American people, they probably would have starved to death long, long ago. However, freedmen in particular harbored a seething hatred for Native people that many historians think was the first appearance of something starting to look like modern racism in America, well before it was fully developed and directed against black people from Africa in particular. For example, in a previous colony in the area, an entire tribe had been killed by colonists in retaliation, apparently, for merely a stolen cup. And in the early days of Virginia, white settlers would dispose of captured children from wars with Native Americans by tossing the children into the water and shooting them in the head for sport as they struggled to not drown. It is very hard to imagine this kind of behavior towards white children and communities occurring, let alone being condoned. At the same time, anxiety was growing about neighboring native peoples. King Philip's War, an incredibly violent war between colonists and Native Americans that ended up lasting 3 years, was unfolding up north in New England. So during this time period, there's a huge, very violent war called King Philip War happening in New England. So in this atmosphere, many freedmen, the middling sort and the poor, wanted to go on an expedition to butcher any natives they came into contact with, regardless of their particular tribe and whether or not those tribes had agreements with the colony. Not coincidentally, many tribes also occupied lands that would make excellent farming lands. And indeed, the freedmen expressed frustration that good land was being wasted on, as they put it, savages. Thus, they had multiple motivations for wanting to go to war with local tribes. The elites of Virginia, however, were not so eager to let them do this. They feared the uncontrolled warfare that such actions could produce, and they opted instead to build forts in certain locations that, they argued to the freedmen, would provide defense against raids from native peoples. However, any attack carried out on Native people would require approval from colonial elites first. The freemen were not impressed with this restraint or with these efforts to build forts. These forts, while they would raise the value of the already rich men's land that they would be built on, because these elite gentlemen usually proposed building these forts on their own land, they would fail in any case to prove very useful for opposing Native American people. For once spotted, Native American people were very good at disappearing into the woods. To successfully attack them, ground forces were needed that could act immediately. It's kind of like maybe imagine building a fort, in the middle of a pond that fish could just swim around. It's just not, it's not effective. So the desires of the restless freemen were not satiated by these policies of the elites. Now, into this picture came Nathaniel Bacon, a newcomer to the colony with capital and connections to the governor, a man named Sir William Berkeley. Now, Bacon was also very ambitious, and although he was not a poor man, and in fact was rather wealthy himself, he appears to have resented the rise of some planters in Virginia who, he felt, did not deserve the riches they enjoyed. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, most of the elites in Virginia would not be elites back home in England. Here comes someone who is a fairly legit elite from England, and he recognizes this and has a lot of scorn for these, so-called elites in Virginia. Moreover, Bacon was very passionate about defending the colony against the threat of attack by native people, whether this threat was real or imagined. So, he began petitioning Berkeley, again the governor of Virginia, Sir William Berkeley, to allow him to lead a militia of freemen into the surrounding regions to attack native tribes wherever they encountered them. Bacon made a case to Berkeley that if he was worried about the anger and the discontent of the freemen, that a good way to make sure they did not vent their anger on colonial elites would be to allow them to vent it on Native Americans instead. In other words, as one historian has put it, quote, discontent with upper-class leadership would be vented in racial hatred, in a pattern that statesmen and politicians of a later age would have found familiar. So this was Bacon's idea. Berkeley, however, Governor Berkeley, refused to let Bacon have his way. Despite that, and perhaps also because Bacon had positioned himself in public appearances around the colony as the natural elite leader for the men who wanted to go hunt native people. He would show up to a tavern to many cheers. Things like this. He was performing as what critics would refer to as a demagogue, right? Courting the passions and the approval of this large group of landless and poor men. So this made Berkeley rather nervous, and largely to try to nip that in the bud and to spite Bacon, he did not give him permission to go lead this force into the woods, right, to massacre Native American people. But when Berkeley refused to do so, Bacon defied him. And in turn, got a little ahead of myself. Bacon defied him and led a party of armed men into the regions surrounding the colony, even though, right, Berkeley had explicitly told him not to. And sure enough, Bacon and his men killed not only many people from hostile native tribes, but they also killed many people from tribes that were allied with the colony. In fact, they had the friendly tribe assist them in capturing and killing the unfriendly ones, and then they turned on these assistants, the friendly Native Americans, and killed them as well. So it was brutal, brutal warfare. So Bacon had openly defied Berkeley, and Berkeley in turn then denounced him. Now, tactically speaking, this was the wrong move, because once labeled rebels by the governor, Berkeley invited Bacon and his men to redirect some of their anger away from Native American people on the frontiers of the colony and towards Virginian elites instead. And that's exactly what happened. And over the course of the next several months, tensions would mount and eventually open warfare would break out, with a band of mostly poor and middling farmers led by Bacon attacking the estates of wealthier planters and, eventually, burning all of Jamestown to the ground. However, it's important to note that despite this civil war, that they turned on the elite whites of Virginia only after satiating their desire to attack as many native communities as possible, and only after they were compelled to do so by being labeled rebels and traitors by Governor Berkeley. And this suggests, as one historian has put it, that, quote, resentment of an alien race might be more powerful than resentment of an upper class. End quote. And this was the lesson, it appears, that many elites took from Bacon's rebellion. After Bacon died in October 1676 of dysentery, the rest of his rebellious crew was easily controlled and apprehended, and most were allowed to simply switch their allegiance back to the governor without any punishment. So although the rebellion failed for the most part, it did extract some concessions in terms of increasing the representation of poor farmers. For example, some of the bans on voting, men without land, those bans on voting were relaxed to a certain extent. More importantly, it left a vivid example in the minds of Virginian elites about the danger posed by a large, proud, and poor population that could at any time rebel against their betters. And as far as their economic situation went, the poor of Virginia remained dangerously poor, numerous, and unhappy. And just around this time, slavery started appearing as a possible solution to this tinderbox situation. Now, there were many causes behind the increase of slavery in the latter half of the 17th century. First, the population of the colonists in the area tripled. So as farms slowly increased in number, more labor was needed than before to farm them. So you have a lot of demand for labor, even more than you did before. Yet at the same time, fewer Englishmen and women were coming to the Chesapeake, because the economy after 1680 had improved in England. So it became less rational to gamble your life on making the trip to the New World when your prospects were looking better in England. The Industrial Revolution was also starting to get underway, and that meant that there was a large demand for factory labor back in England. So now a lot of that landless population that had been pushed off the land, they were more likely to find jobs in England, so no need to go to the New World. Moreover, at the exact same time, slaves were becoming more accessible and cheaper. So the market was shifting at the same time indentured white servants were becoming less plentiful. And their natural population was also starting to increase, the natural population of African slaves, that is, as the small population that existed in the Chesapeake started reproducing in Virginia. Finally, one solution to being an indentured servant in miserable conditions had been running away, and some African slaves also tried to run away, but it was much harder to successfully run away as a black slave because you would more immediately be noticed in the surrounding areas. Since you were not white, you would stand out. So there's all of these factors coming together to make African slavery a more attractive solution. But in order to make it viable and long-term, some new power dynamics would have to be instituted in Virginia to make sure that slaves and poor white people never binded together, never discovered a solidarity in their shared economic subjugation. So, new hierarchies needed to be created. And you can think of this as the deeper and even more fundamental reason for the increase in slavery. Not only did slavery solve the labor problem in a straightforward sense, but it also helped reduce class tensions in the Chesapeake. It is important to note that it did not do this by improving the lot of poor freemen very much. Most of the best land was still owned and controlled by the wealthier planters, and serious economic and political obstacles still remained in the way of lower class freemen from getting what they considered their fair share. However, what the growth of slavery did do was offer a way for even the poorest of poor white men to feel equal and included in Virginian society by being white. And through being white, at least, everyone was above the black slave. All white people were above the black slave. Bringing this new order to life, however, required new laws and new forms of brutality in the Chesapeake. Unlike indentured servants, slaves had no hope for eventual freedom, and thus an increase in terror was required to control them. As one historian has explained, slaves could not be made to work for fear of losing liberty, so they had to be made to fear for their lives. And the laws quickly provided masters with the freedom to create and maintain this fear. In 1669, for example, it becomes legal to, quote-unquote, accidentally kill your slave in the course of punishing him or her. The laws were soon extended to also make it legal to kill any runaway slave. The owner of the slave would be compensated by the public for his financial loss, and the person who killed the slave would in all likelihood be congratulated on it, far, far from being brought to justice for the act. Now, it is highly unlikely that any such laws could have been passed regarding English servants, white servants. And indeed, even in the days where their labor was in such short supply and so crucial to the success of the Virginia colony, they never were subjected to this sort of treatment. If the Virginian elites had tried to subject white servants to this kind of regime, it would have been difficult getting past a tradition of basic English rights and liberties that provided some basic protection against the most grotesque of abuses. African people, however, were not Englishmen or women, and so could never claim such rights. And as rich planters discovered how useful slavery was for solving both their economic and their political problems, they sought to make the distinction between black people and white people even more distinct. In 1670, for example, a law was passed forbidding blacks and Native Americans to own quote-unquote Christian servants, as some had in fact done. This ensured that even if blacks or Native Americans had converted to Christianity, on the basis of race, not religion, which had previously stood in as the primary distinction, they could not be in positions of authority over white people, who were all Christians. So even if a black person is able to gain their freedom, gain some land, be prosperous enough to want to buy their own servant or their own slave, they would have to buy Native American or African people, because black and Native American people, not white people, but specifically black and Native American people, were not allowed to own Christian servants, which more or less translated to white most of the time. In 1680, moreover, a law was passed calling for the punishment of any slave who raises his hand to any Christian, again, read white person, as 30 lashes on the back. So, if any slave basically tried to enact self-defense against a white person, they would get 30 lashes on the back. Again, the point that was being made here is that black people would not be permitted to interact in any way with a white person on the basis of being equals, or even in a shared basic humanity. And in 1691, perhaps the most important line to be drawn, interracial marriage was also made illegal. And it was no small fine for violating this, it was banishment from the colony itself, which is about as clear a message as you can make, that any relationship between white and black people that even suggests that they are on the same level is not welcome in Virginian society. Finally, in 1705, all property that some of the slaves had managed to obtain in Virginia was seized and sold to poor whites. So think of the dynamics implied here, right? Not only do you not have a right to property, but elites, if you are a slave, but elites used the property of slaves to assist your betters, which in this case were poor whites. So this really exemplifies, right, how even the poorest of the poor whites did enjoy very official status and material benefit over all black people. Now, economically, these policies resulted in less white servants and therefore less desperately poor whites in the colony. However, the disparity of wealth remained more or less the same or even worse, meaning that while there were less poor people around, the poor and lower class people, less poor white people, the poor and lower class white people that were there enjoyed no greater proportion of the wealth than they did before racialized slavery became the norm. However, the white servants that were still around did enjoy, generally, a better deal when they were done with their services than they had previously been afforded. There were still some white indentured servants. And poor whites, moreover, became electorally valuable as their vote was restored fully, and thus they became a population to be courted by politicians. And if you need to be courted by politicians, this is always a source of potential social power. Perhaps even more substantial than these benefits, however, which in the practical economic impact were limited, was the social benefit of the increasing distinction between blacks and whites. For what elite Virginians learned from Bacon's rebellion was that the way to prevent poor whites from turning on you was to allow them to vent their frustration on a racial other, and then to build solidarity with them on the basis of that racial status and superiority that you shared with elites, even if, right, you were incredibly poor compared to them. As one of the greatest historians of this time period put it, Virginia's small farmers could perceive a common identity with the large because there was one. Neither was a slave, and both were equal in not being slaves.